David Jackson, welcome to the Without Limits podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on, mate. We've got a bit of a history from rugby through to me coming to your seminars, calisthenics, to more recently the breathwork. So it's great to sit down with you and unpack kind of how life's been for you, but also kind of where you're at now. I think the topic of conversation today being breathwork is something that's super relevant to this podcast, and also a point of difference to some of the guests that we've had on. I've made it very clear to the listeners that the sorts of people I want to bring on here are credible authorities in their space around training, nutrition, mindset, breathwork, all the things that can help lead to a high performance life. And you've been someone who's been a professional athlete, taken those lessons and learnings and the things that weren't available to you then, and then brought that into your life now through the medium of breathwork, which will hopefully we'll unpack in a way that's succinct and also gives people practical things that they can go away and think of then bake into their own training and lifestyle. Yeah. Before we get on with all of that, I always ask people what Without Limits means to them. So I don't know whether you know that or not.
Yeah, no, I've listened to the podcast, obviously. So I knew that question was coming. I remember hearing your brother saying, I've been thinking about this all day. So yeah, give it a bit of thought. And the first thing that I sort of, in my mind, I reframe without limits. To me, that means freedom. And when I reflect on that, I've actually been trying to see what that looks like for me for a long time. Like, what does freedom actually look like? Because it's very easy, and I certainly found this, that I'm often easily drawn to thinking I want to do something that someone else is doing, or the perception of what I think someone else is doing. They aren't even actually doing that. So trying to look at what does freedom look like, or exploring what does that look like for me. And over time, 3 big things coming out. One being labels, the other being time, and the third one being striving, and trying to get away from some of those things. So like labels, rugby was something, being a rugby player was something I loved, but the label of it challenged me mentally, and I didn't have any sort of tools to cope with that. Like when I retired from a brain injury, well, now you're no longer a rugby player, like, what are you? And even when I was playing rugby, I took it too personally. If I played well, boom, high. If I played low, like me as a person, like, because I identified as that rugby player. So trying to get away from labels has been helpful for sort of freedom. But then that's difficult, because as soon as you like finish your rugby career, you go into something else, and then it's like, okay, now I'm this coach, or now I'm this and that. So it's still that's still like an ongoing thing. But I think with anything, a bit like with breathing that we'll get into, like awareness at the first point gives you like so much. So just being aware of that, I know that that's something that I don't want to label myself again, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I'm sure you resonate with that, and most people that have played sport or anything will do. Time has been something that I feel like it's just like as you get older, you start to learn a little bit more about like yourself, and life in itself just being like a bit of self-discovery of what do I like? On the surface, like I like training and I like rugby and I like doing stuff or whatever. And then realizing for me over the last 18 months that it's more about whether I can be free of time determines more so whether I enjoy the thing that I'm doing. So you've got to go in the gym and you've just got 35 minutes, you've got to get it done, and I'm looking at the clock all the way through and I don't enjoy it. Washing the dishes, I might not typically like washing the dishes, but if I'm washing the dishes and I'm trying to do it quickly so I can get on to some other task, I won't enjoy it. But if there's no time frame on it, I can enjoy anything, which is a bit weird, but at the same time, there's a bit of freedom in that, because it's like, okay, I'm starting to understand what is the makeup of the scenario of things that allows me to enjoy stuff. And then the striving thing is an interesting one in that, again, more of an awareness of it, of like, when I'm striving for things, it's like I'm creating the limits or limiting myself, and I'm not feeling free. But it comes at there's a a pull in both directions of like, you want to do stuff and want to achieve things. And I want to share what I've learned about breathing with athletes and with coaches. And in order to do that, I have to have a purpose and strive to do those things. But when I'm constantly striving for more, it doesn't feel like I'm without limits, or it doesn't feel like I'm free. So it's a work in progress, but there were three things that come out for me.
Mate, I reckon that's probably the best answer I've had.
There we go.
Yeah, mate, profound.
It's not even an answer. It's not even an answer. It's just.
I think this is why you're such a great guest, because of all that life experience, and like I say, being in high performance sport, elite sport, professional sport, through to where you are now, and there's a strong correlation actually between kind of what you're saying and the mindset coach Tom that I sat down with the other day. Just a deeper level of thinking about your own existence and your own purpose in the world, that I think maybe comes through things like breath work and things where you're a little bit, you're more calm and still for longer periods of time, as opposed to people that are equally as high performing, maybe in training and sport and what have you, but haven't got that yin and yang to their being.
Yeah. I think it's so just on. It's not that, and we'll get into the breathing side of things. And there's some breathing practices where there is that stillness, and I'm someone that like could not sit and do that at the start for various different reasons. Some because of poor breathing, some psychologically or whatever. But you make a great point that life, particularly when we're striving, there's so much that can occupy us and there's so much that we can do. And not that these things are necessarily bad, but me personally, if I allow myself to be so distracted that I don't think a bit more deeply about, well, what am I about? What am I here for? Like, I know this is probably maybe not where you wanted the podcast to go.
I think this is brilliant. This is exactly where I want it to go.
Yeah, but that's as much as I love like making an athlete hold their breath as hard as they can and do all these things with them from the breath side of it, with the breath training side of things. There's this this other avenue that when you sit and do nothing, it's quite a you start thinking a bit differently. Yeah, no, I love it. I think you've probably unpacked a little bit about who David Jackson is, but my next sort of question to you was I don't know. I don't know. Still working it out.
Well, again, because you reference the fact of labels, and I've talked to this a lot, and sometimes I don't want to keep talking about it because I feel as whenever I used to go on as a guest to podcasts, I always talked about this identity crisis that I kind of had when my whole childhood was trying to be about a professional rugby player. And I kind of had times where I felt as though I was it, times where I felt I still need to try and get there, and then it was like all gone and I didn't want to be it anymore. You use the term labels. For me, it was identity, and I think the two are very the same, which I think is really interesting. But if you were to give a bit of an elevator pitch on who you are, and touch on not just who you are right now, but who have you been? Because I think the rugby thing and the injury and the stuff you talked about, your connection with the label of being a rugby player, I think is a really cool story for some of the listeners of this. My listener base, I think, is very diverse, but there's a lot of ex-athletes, aspiring athletes, current athletes that are thinking about what's next. So I think that story is quite relevant.
Yeah. In terms of how and how I retired and stuff.
So I think let's talk about who you are right now.
Yeah.
And I think we will then go into the area of your life as a rugby player, because that obviously then that was the catalyst, I think, for the things that you've done post rugby and your interests.
Yeah, my elevator pitch is relatively like I as a breathing coach. Like I'm an S&C coach. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, UKSCA and all that jazz. But I work on the breathing side of strength and conditioning, which is something that no one else really does because we weren't educated on it or knew that other than say like bracing for a heavy lift. That's the only time like breathing really would come into our sort of education or application when we're coaching. So I work now on breathing, on all the different dimensions of breathing that are part of the body, part of our training, the systems that are guiding our breathing, that are all like looking at the ones, what is trainable, and there's far more that's trainable than not. The difference, I guess, with breathing is there's conscious breathing and there's unconscious breathing. There's the automatic, and then there's like, I'm going to do something with it. And we get to play with both, in that I can do something with the conscious to change my autonomic, foundation of my breathing, which does plug in then to autonomic nervous system. So that starts to get really interesting when we're talking about stress management, when we're talking about recovery from exercise and all of that. So that's sort of where I've landed now, which feels like currently a sweet spot of everything that I've done through my life, literally coming together in one thing that I'm able to deliver as best I can, that draws out the different skills and things that I've done, and comes from a place of a passion from something that helped me with my brain health from recovering from brain injury that I can talk about obviously later, but as well as all the different things that I'd done in the past that maybe didn't necessarily at the time feel necessarily that relevant. So before I turned professional with my rugby, I did an engineering degree at Loughborough Uni, got a master's in materials engineering for a first. It's like, yeah, but do I use that? It feels like, well, no, but actually it was some of the skills in terms of being able to read scientific literature and be able to, pull out from those things like what is going on. I don't do engineering and material stuff now, but the skill set that I learned there when I'm looking at breathing research and respiratory research, rather than just reading the conclusion or reading the headline or listening to the headline that, say, someone like Andrew Huberman might say, I can go and look at it and go, well, what is it actually saying? And often what's quite interesting is like, what's it also not saying? And be able to put, because the world, I guess, of coaches, that I do a lot of education with coaches, do mentoring with other breathing coaches, where they maybe have had a much less scientific introduction into that coaching modality, and it being more of this is how you do the exercises. And now people are starting to want to understand a bit more about why do we do them? And they just haven't been, their background, they don't have that that scientific background to understand what that is doing. I did a teacher training degree, so I'm a qualified chemistry secondary science school teacher. I managed 1 year, which meant you were fully qualified. Don't think anyone would take me back, but they can't. They sort of, you do your NQT and they can't take that away from you. And I was told that I would never like qualify as a teacher because of my monotone voice. And this was this was the teacher that was supposed to be mentoring me. Luckily, that was in my first term. Luckily, she got piles. Not luckily for her, but
unfortunate.
Luckily for me. And then, so she was then off literally for the rest of and now I got then a new mentor who was really great. And I do a lot of teaching now. And that skill set that I learned in there, even though I'm not teaching kids that used to make me pull my hair out and cry in the car park in my car. But I use those teaching skills and understanding what it takes to sort of educate people. And then the brain injury and my rugby giving me an understanding of what, like, when you're working with a professional athlete, knowing what it is like for them to be a professional athlete. It's not all sunshine and roses. It's not all, we'll do this extra thing and this because all these more things are going to be better. Like, they don't have the time, they don't want to, the workload, the schedules, all those things. And the ironic thing, I guess the biggest one is like my brain injury finished my rugby career back in 2013. And without that, I wouldn't have explored breathing as a modality to look at for originally sort of brain health and well-being, but then it knocked a minute off my 5K time with zero training. And I was like, hold on a minute, this isn't just for like the lie down on the floor and do the quiet breathing stuff. This is also, there's something going on here about something that I've never trained, never even thought about, which seems ridiculous in that when you're blowing out of your arse in a fitness session or in a game or whatever you're doing, you're in halfway through your high rocks or whatever, you're blowing out of your arse. If someone said to you, like, I could make this feel a bit more comfortable, you'd bite their arm off. And then realizing that there's so much opportunity to train the different elements that make up breathing, looking at it through the lens of an S&C coach, where you go, well, yeah, it's a movement pattern. Why can't we train a movement pattern? It's a skill. I can train the skill. It's there's a load of muscles that are involved in this movement. Well, we can train them, and you know, there's a whole load more that goes into it too. So, yeah, that's a little bit of, I guess, where I'm now, and then how I got to here, and all parts of probably what I've gone through. I guess the final bit is I've been trying to get you up to the mountains in Wales for like people, when you finish playing rugby, two things normally happen. You either don't exercise and get really fat, or you go and do stupid like running event or some sort of stupid long distance event or something. So I've for my sins got into running much further than you think your body could do, and then seeing what happens.
I'm keen to talk about that because obviously it's going to be quite relevant. I hate the phrase, but pick your brains on a few things. Okay, so
I can tell you what not to do because I've done that.
We breath work as a concept. The people's perception of what that is, like you said, you got the kind of yoga end of sitting really still, in through the nose, out through the mouth, trying to calm the mind, versus the I guess the more performance component of breath work and how we can improve our 5K time by a minute, etc. The recovery point on the nervous system, the impacts on HRV and all that kind of stuff. So there's quite a lot of things that we're kind of talking about. But in your domain, so as a strength and conditioning coach, and the way you use breath work, which I think is actually the way I would probably encourage the listeners of this podcast to use breath work. What is breath work?
Great. What is breath work? I actually now sort of call it breath training. Just means no different. Like it's the same thing, but it's just that there's often quite a lot of misconceptions around what breath work might be, because breath work to someone might be, oh, I've seen a hyperventilation practice like the Wim Hof method, for example, and just think, well, that's it. Or they've done some yoga and there's some pranayama in their yoga, and they may call it breath work there, and it can be all these things. But I guess my area of interest with it is I am interested in all of it. But my main area of interest is how we can train the different aspects of like the biochemistry of breathing. Like breathing controls all of the chemistry within your body. The biomechanical side of breathing, which is a little bit more when we think about like what a physio might do with us around our breathing, they're trying to get us to access our diaphragm, trying to get us to move our rib cage. A bit more obvious from like an S&C type of thing. And then the psychological side. So we've got these three different domains that all are trainable, all are affected by, or are breathing effects or within all these things. And if someone hasn't explored breathing and they're already a high-performing athlete or not, whether they're high-performing athlete or not, if you haven't explored breathing, even just some of the simplest things can make a huge difference. It's no different to like if you've never looked at nutrition and you love your training and then you start looking at your nutrition in a bit more detail, you're going to get some benefits. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, so going back, I just think COVID times, those people that are familiar with myself, Charlie, and where we were at that stage, we did the Oxygen Advantage course. I actually sat down and interviewed Patrick McEwen, who wrote the book, read the book, and there was loads of people saying, what is that book? Can I read it? And we went fucking down the rabbit hole with the nasal breathing piece and what have you. So I think people are very, in the fitness space, are very hyper aware of nasal breathing, whether that's on their zone 2 piece on their bike or going out for a nasal only run and this concept of nasal only. I don't think many people potentially know why, and I often get asked, why are we sort of doing it? So we'll try and unpack that. But the three things you said there: biochemistry, biomechanics, and fine. Yeah. So let's touch on the biochemistry first and foremost. What's the impact on that?
Your body's like set. So your nervous system and your breathing go hand in hand. So you mentioned HRV earlier. And a lot of people will have devices, Whoops, or what other devices are available, that will measure, will give them some measure of HRV. A classic example of this is 99% of the like professional rugby players I work with, I'll ask them at the start, do you measure HRV? Have you got a Whoop or anything like that? And normally the answer is I used to, but it would tell me that I wasn't recovered, and I started to go training, so it messed with my head like, what's the point? I can't control it. So with HRV, and this is happening at the where I was saying I was at earlier, top level, like national team sports, like we're measuring HR, we're measuring something, but we're not giving them any, so we know what it is. And it's like, well, what's the point if you're not giving them anything to improve it? And your breathing and your HRV, your breathing and your nervous system are linked, and your breathing is a reflection of your nervous system. It communicates with the nervous system. Your sort of autonomic baseline of breathing is mainly driven through sensitivity to carbon dioxide. And so the more tolerable I am of carbon dioxide, the more I am going to be more resilient with my nervous system. And you're going to impact all sorts of things within the body in terms of oxygen delivery, in terms of circulation, in terms of blood pressure. Almost all those things are all improved when we improve that. And with HRV is going to be improved. They're one of the same thing. You're not going to improve your breathing and not see an improvement in HRV, which is then going to be a reflection of like recovery.
So, because I think that HRV piece is very relevant, and you'll hear about that. And I think the usual intervention is people go straight to like sleep, try and sleep better, rest more, like try and de-stress and put in coping mechanisms without actually treating the root cause, which is kind of how you're breathing and the breathwork piece. Just to go back a step, you mentioned CO2 tolerance, and that's a big part of this.
Yeah.
As we grow up, we're often taught that we exhale CO2, so it's bad, get it out of your system and inhale oxygen because that's what you need to survive.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in a basic sense, that kind of makes sense, but also it doesn't in this, right?
Yes.
So
it's like it is true, but it also is. So I think that when you come across some of the, and I was the same, like the first, I did my training with Patrick. I'm one of his master instructors and mentors. So I work with him at the Oxygen Advantage. And when you first dive into that, there's this like, wow, breathing's not about oxygen. It's about CO2. And that's like quite a woof. And then the more you go in a bit of a deeper level of like what's going, and just ask more questions. And as long as you write, I think I'd seen Jen say this, like as long as you have to ask the right questions though, if you're not asking the right question, you're not going to get the right answer. But when you go a little bit deeper into it, you go, okay, so what's the most important thing in order to keep you alive? Oxygen. Like every single tissue and cell in your body needs oxygen. 2 years ago, I watched my dad take his last breath. You see the impact. And it's like this thing of like just going back right to the beginning question at the start. Physical body there, he's not there. And something has left. And it's like, that's one of the things that made me think a lot deeper about who we are, because it was like, he's still there. The body is still there. We love training our bodies, but there's something else that's keeping us alive. But in terms of a gap, what gas is important in terms of keeping us alive, oxygen is the thing that the tissues need. Therefore, because it's the most important, the body needs to be designed in a way that it's there in absolute abundance, or it is there in absolute abundance because of its importance. So we have something like 25 trillion red blood cells that carry 98% of our oxygen. Within those red blood cells, you've got the hemoglobin that the oxygen is attaching to. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought on it.
Talking about the sort of the role or importance of carbohydrate. CO2 tolerance.
So oxygen's there in absolute abundance. 98% is dissolved in the blood. Normal levels of oxygen is about 95 to 99%. 95 to 99% of 25 trillion red blood cells. It's a lot. Yeah. And so it doesn't go down and your brain notices it's got, so breathing, the autonomic or the automatic part of breathing means that there must be receptors somewhere in your brain, they're in the brainstem, in the respiratory centers, that are measuring something in order to make you breathe without thinking about it. And so if those receptors were responsive to oxygen, they'd have to drop out of a certain range to trigger a reaction from the brain. And that would mean then your oxygen levels are going down and then back up and going down and then back up, which isn't safe and healthy for the body. It wants it to be as consistent as possible. So therefore, it doesn't actually use oxygen to manage your breathing, even though your breathing gets oxygen in. The receptors are most sensitive. They will respond, but when oxygen's at more critically low levels, which we'd be talking about hypoxia, so lower than 91%, in terms of blood oxygen saturation. But the levels of carbon dioxide that your tissues are constantly making as a part of cellular respiration is going into the blood, transferring to the lungs, and then you're breathing it out. The CO2 has to get out, like anything, like everything in moderation. If you have too much CO2 in your body, you could die because CO2 makes the blood more acidic. But if you have too little CO2 within the body as a baseline, because you're breathing too much air just in your natural day, you're very inefficient with your breathing, you're going to breathe more. You can't get any more oxygen in because you're basically already full, because that's so important. But what happens if I take a big breath in? I take a big breath out. Your inhale dictates your exhale in terms of size, in terms of volume. If I breathe more air out than I need to, I'm offloading more carbon dioxide. There's less carbon dioxide in my lungs, in my blood, in my body. And then we get this like down spiral of carbon dioxide helps with oxygen delivery. It helps with circulation. It helps with blood pressure. It helps with the brain function, thinking. It helps with vagus nerve. It helps literally with everything. So the main problem for most of us in today's society is that for whatever reason, mine was a brain injury, but any type of stress and just unawareness, meaning that we're breathing poorly, breathing inefficiently.
Too much.
And too much. So then the too much doesn't mean you're getting any more. The oxygen's sort of irrelevant because that's stabilizing itself because it's so important. But the CO2 we're getting rid of, and then we become more sensitive to it. And then we're stuck in that sort of, in that cycle. So yes, if you made someone breathe enough carbon dioxide to an extreme range, you could make the body so acidic that you could die. So it's not like always more is better, but we're not on that scale, if that makes sense. We're not ever in danger of being that far, because ultimately so when you hold your breath, for example, you keep CO2 inside. What happens? Eventually you can't handle it anymore and you breathe. And the CO2 levels will normalize pretty quickly. But that's one of the ways that we actually help people to improve their CO2 tolerance. From a sporting perspective, CO2 making the blood more acidic, we're improving our body's buffering capacity to acidic environments. What happens when you get anaerobic? When you work with that oxygen and you generate more lactate, you're getting more acidic. So we can expose the body to a more or a stronger sort of stimulus in terms of like disrupting this acid-base balance that we get through any hard training. But we can add that. We can add breathing as another load, another modality to add a stimulus to that. If we add a stronger stimulus, then we can get a stronger adaptation.
Let's go there quickly, because I think that's probably a good one for people, the more athletic population. So basically what you're saying is, when we train anaerobically, the cost on the body is high, right? Particularly physically, muscularly, all that kind of thing. We can use breath work to create the same environment, but without that cost on the body, the taxation on the muscles and things.
Yeah, we got two options. That's like if I'm working with someone coming back from an injury, to try and offload deconditioning that they might get, where they can't, for X number of weeks or months, they can't work at a given intensity to actually get anaerobic. Well, we can make you anaerobic and still maintain some of that conditioning on like a tissue level by doing some breath holding during your rehabilitation phase, if that makes sense. When we're fully fit and also we're looking to gain an edge, and I want to do something a little bit more, so I get a little bit more adaptation, I can add breath holding to the hardest work that I do. And then what I love about it is it lets me explore all those three areas. So we talked about the biochemistry, which the breath holding will help me be exposed to high levels of CO2. Because you're going to get some drop in oxygen if you do a strong enough breath hold, you're going to get a greater increase in lactate. The body gets better at clearing lactate, tolerating lactate, and naturally balancing those acidity levels within the blood. And at the same time, when you finish a breath hold, your breathing mechanics want to go all over the place, but you know it's going to happen. So then I can practice in training. How do I recover my breathing well whilst I'm being super challenged? Because I'm literally just trying to hold my breath to the point where I felt like I was going to suffocate myself. And then I'm like practicing the skill of controlling my breathing mechanically with at the same time tolerating this, exposure to acidity that I've chosen to do myself, which then brings in the psychological bit. Can you choose to create this discomfort for yourself, which actually this high levels of CO2 are linked to fear centers in the brain, and it is a genuine stress in terms of disrupting acid-base balance on the body, that you're experiencing a real life mental and physiological stress that weirdly you're choosing to do yourself. And then not the weirdest thing, but the most fascinating thing then comes in when you then do that and you let go of the breath hold, then you start to realize, right, how am I going to get myself back under control? Physiologically, heart rate, nervous system, and also brain, to be calm. And it's then you go to your breathing for that. So we've got this nice like full circle, full loop of like, I'm using the breath work in terms of a breath hold to create this stimulus, and then I'm using my breathing to actually help myself manage that stress, which for a sports person transcends into like on-field, complex situation, stressful situation in terms of crowd, time of game, whatever the thing is going on. And they've already learned off that how to stay calm, how to manage their nervous system response, how to manage their mental sort of stress response with their breathing so that they can stay calm and can perform, as well as having a greater sort of capacity and resilience to be able to control their breathing. For people outside of sport, that's transcending into like, how do I manage my stress response in my day-to-day living with there was quite an extreme sort of example depending on how hard you go on your breath holding.
Let's touch on breath holds, because that's sort of one way in which we can try and train this.
Yeah.
So I remember going back to those COVID days when I was really exploring this. I used to walk to work, and it was, I think, inhale, exhale, hold, and there was a certain number of steps I had to try and achieve to give me my baseline sort of measurement. And you're right, like it's like alarm bells going off in your fucking head, going fucking breathe.
Yeah.
So
and I love those voices. I love training those voices, and I love training those voices with people. Like it's
we actually got to the stage where we'd come into the gym, we'd start doing it carrying yokes and things. We'd put the blood pulse oximeter on our fingers. Farmers carries all sorts, and it does become quite competitive, and it is like training. We fell off the wagon a little bit with it, to be honest, and this might encourage it to start again, but it's kind of exactly what it says in the tin, right? A breath hold is breathing in a normal breath, breathing out.
Yeah, so we typically do it on an exhale rather than an inhale. So on a normal exhalation, where we're trying to create a hypoxic and hypercapnic response, which is just fancy words for low oxygen and high CO2, to just expose the body to that environment. We expose the body to that environment, it gets more efficient, or it gets better at dealing with a lower oxygen environment, and it also gets used to high levels of CO2. What that then, why that sort of explains why we do it after an exhale. If I do a breath hold on an inhale, it'll be easier to hold your breath for longer, but you won't get the response you want as quickly, in that you've filled your lungs with air, so there's more oxygen in them. And then you start holding your breath. When oxygen's leaving your blood, whatever's in your lungs is going to replenish what was in your blood. So you'll go longer. You might feel, I did a longer breath hold, but it's like, but comes down to like coaching, like an understanding, why are you doing what you're doing? Do you know what you're trying to achieve? And when you know what you're trying to achieve from this perspective, it makes a lot of sense to do on an exhale rather than inhale, even though it might feel a little bit harder.
Yeah. So through the nose?
We typically say, we would be trying to encourage nasal breathing when we're not really being challenged. So at the start of a breath hold, we're not being challenged. The other thing is, like, if you feel stressed, it will impact, because the psychological side of breathing is a real dimension to it that will impact your baseline. If I'm feeling stressed, those alarm bells in the head are going to go off quicker. I'm not going to be able to hold my breath as much. Not because this day my CO2 tolerance has suddenly plummeted, although it'll feel like it, but just because I'm stressed and my nervous system is on like alert.
So a period of down regulation through nasal breathing prior to doing breath holds
you might be able to create a stronger breath hold. So just the act of nasal breathing versus mouth breathing influences the brain and nervous system differently. So just that one breath you take before
That's kind of where I was going with the inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose.
Smile.
And then
look at nature. You're trying to like stack everything in the, right, keep my nervous system relaxed.
Yeah.
If you want to go further. If you want to make it harder, it's like make yourself as stressed as possible.
And then try and do it.
But that's not really that. I wouldn't advise that. It's hard enough as it is.
So we get the exhale.
Yeah.
We're holding our breath.
Yeah.
Like I said, I referenced the fact that I used to walk steps.
Yeah.
Are you encouraging people to be doing something at the very base? That people want to go and train this right away? Sit still or walk or time it on your watch?
One of the things that we'd do is, if you are very sensitive to carbon dioxide, if you're like a little CO2 tolerance test, the BOLT score, it's called, the Oxford Advantage, is holding your breath after that exhale with just sitting still relaxed until you just get the urge to breathe, and timing how long that is in seconds. So that's
actually a really, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is I guess that's the starting point.
It's just
right?
That's just finding out I call it part of the autonomic baseline. So my autonomic baseline is things like CO2 sensitivity at rest, when I'm not trying to hold my breath or think about it. What's that time delay that the body can manage comfortably? And
then we can use that as a baseline measurement. We can go away and do some breath work, and we can come back and use that as something that we did we improve it?
You're going to see that improve. And if that's low, your HRV is going to be low. If that's higher, your HRV, as you improve that, your HRV will go up together. So HRV being another part of that autonomic baseline. A sort of key number on that is if that number's less than 10 seconds. So if you get the urge to breathe within 10 seconds after being just sat relaxed, it means that you're quite sensitive to CO2. Mine was like 7, 8 seconds when I started, but I'd had my brain injury. And you don't want to then go and stress the body further, and you're going to find it very uncomfortable to do those breath holds and walking and trying to push it. So, really we want people sort of going above 15 seconds on that before we try and push them any further. But walking and taking just a few steps is fine for literally any. Yeah.
If they are beneath 10 or beneath 15, how do they then start the training?
So they would start with like very short paces walking. Like, you're not trying to like push it. You need to experience a little bit of CO2 gently, and you need to let the nervous system know that it's okay. Whereas if you make it more stressful, it's just going to put more in. With the CO2 being linked to the fear centers and panic centers of the brain. In an extreme case, if someone's really sensitive, they might be prone to panic attacks. They might not know they are, or they may know they are, but then you could potentially trigger yourself to have a panic attack. But you'd have to be working quite hard to do that, if that makes sense.
Got you. So for anyone listening, that sort of baseline score is a normal breath, exhale, sit and hold your breath. As soon as you feel the urge to breathe, you're timing yourself. If you feel the urge to breathe, we're looking for something over 15 seconds. If we do clear that mark, so if we don't clear that mark, we're just then using the breath holds to start to slowly expose ourselves to a higher tolerance of CO2.
Yeah, but you just need to go real gentle, basically.
Yeah.
Other big ones like heart conditions, like you don't want to stress the nervous system that way, and pregnancy.
Yeah. Cool.
But that's sort of what you'd expect with. It's like, just think of it as like it's a hard training session, but if you're going to push it, it's a hard training session.
Yeah. And then, so if we are over 15, we can then start to push the boat out a little bit. So in terms of like sets and reps and frequency, and what are we looking for? So we're looking for a breath hold until literally we feel as though we're going to pass over and pass out.
Like anything, depends on the context, depends on the person, depends what are they trying to achieve from it, and depends on their experience. So like anything, there's a training effect. You get better at holding your breath as you practice holding your breath, and there is a skill to that. There's your like that CO2 tolerance is like the obvious one, but there's a skill to being able to stay calm in your mind and work on the psychological side of it. There's the diaphragm's going to start contracting as the brain is being signaled from the highest levels of CO2. Send a message down your phrenic nerve to your diaphragm. And that's going to feel uncomfortable, but like, if you're doing any work on training your diaphragm and understanding what these things are, you can start to navigate this and actually become better at something that is going to then ultimately change your physiology and change your nervous system, change your physical response to breathlessness and like feeling out of breath during exercise, as well as that mental side of like knowing what it is, and when you go to that sort of dark place, how you can bring yourself back quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. How many times a week should I be doing breath holds?
as much as possible, it's a case of like integrating it into training sessions. So it's not needing to be done as an additional. One area where it works really well is in warm-ups, because it also upregulates the nervous system. So there was a study in recent, it was within rugby, warm-ups for rugby, and they showed that during the breath holds, and they were doing decent breath holds, like 30 seconds or so, but just on like a static stationary bike with no resistance. So it wasn't particularly hard in terms of like metabolically. But what they saw was like an upregulation of sympathetic activation through interest. Or I found it interesting. It was dulling down or sort of shutting off the vagus nerve to actually like dull down parasympathetic activation to ramp up sympathetic, which particularly if you're going to go in the gym and it's early morning and you're tired, or it's late afternoon and you're having a bit of a slump, you do a few strong breath holds. Once you've trained yourself to like be able to do a decent one, you'll get way more arousal than like taking some caffeine, for example.
Yeah, cool. Okay, this is where it gets interesting for people. So I hope.
And then in conditioning sessions is where it gets. Nasty.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure people are following kind of where we're at, right? Yeah. So we're training breath holds to increase CO2 tolerance, to create the environment that is alike with a stressful situation, whether you're playing sport or even just in a stressful situation. Yeah. But then also using that to try and drive the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response, obviously to try and encourage you to go fight the fucking beast in the gym. Yeah. On the other side of that, the parasympathetic nervous system is obviously influenced by breath. Yeah. And this is where the nasal breathing comes into it.
Yeah. And this is where like it's important that if we go, right, I can quite obviously stress an athlete further, even if you know nothing about training. If I said, right, we're going to do 30 on, 30 off on the bike, as hard as you can for those 30 seconds. And every time you do those 30 seconds, you're going to start on a breath hold. You're going to think I'm freaking bonkers.
Well, you're going to know. You did something with me and Chad quite recently, having not done any breath work for probably 2 years on an assault bike.
And it's harder, right? But you don't have to be a scientist to know, well, holding my breath whilst I'm doing this is going to make it harder. Okay, so we can explain as to why these things, then like the dose is interesting of going like, well, how often should I be doing that?
Let's do that then, because that sort of finishes the CO2 tolerance piece, I think. Let's go into why should we be doing that beyond the breath hold as we start to then exercise. I think it's just an amplification of what everything we've sort of said, isn't it?
Yeah, and that if you're looking for an edge, you've got those two options. You've got looking for an edge. If you want to get stronger, you need to put more weight on the bar. If you're looking for an edge in terms of your repeat sprintability or anaerobic conditioning, you need to expose yourself to a bit more lactate and a bit more acidity, and then your body has some time practicing buffering and clearing. So they see on the studies on it, they see with the exhale breath holding, they see an increase in the buffering capacity of the tissues and the blood. They see improvements in lactate clearance. They see improvement in the tolerance of lactate, and a really nice one in the recovery periods, they see a greater increase or improvement in reoxygenation of the tissues. So you get exposed to lower levels of oxygen during the effort, but in the recovery period, their recovery is better than someone that didn't over a 4-week trial. So we're improving we're improving the tolerance of these things, but also the recovery during.
So we've taken a breath hold from sitting and just measuring baseline to then walking to then now in exercise. Yeah. So exhale, breath hold, 30-second assault bike.
You're probably not.
You're not going to hold your breath for that long.
Entire 30 seconds. Yeah. So then there's different ways that we can integrate it in, whether it's the breath, hold your breath, and the effort lasts as long as you can hold your breath. It's like a classic way.
And then you're trying to recover breathing by nasal breathing only, trying to be as calm as possible.
Well, so then it's like this is where it gets nice. It's like anybody could do that in terms of you could just go and tell someone to hold their breath and just shout at them and go, hold your breath, hold it. Where I think that the real gold then starts to come in is, okay, so I'm going to teach you the tools. It's unfair of me to just stress you more and not give you any of the recovery tools. The last thing we're going to do is like the down regulation, as you mentioned, for like the parasympathetic. If we're going to stress our athletes more, or ourselves as an athlete, if we're going to stress our body more to try and get a greater adaptation, we have to give ourselves some greater recovery tools. And I'm not talking, and I love like red light therapy, ice bath, saunas, I've got all that at home, but nothing influences your nervous system like breathing. And it happens in real time. And you can measure it in real time with HRV devices. But it's unfair of me to not give you the tools to recover. And I need to give you the tools in the moment to recover. So what that looks like is the mechanical side of it, being able to mechanically breathe well, to be able to be most efficient in terms of getting oxygen in, getting CO2 out, and then being able to control your exhalation to regulate the nervous system, bring the heart rate down, as well as being able to control my exhale allows me to take a better inhale. A fast, uncontrolled inhale is always going to be shallow upper chest and inefficient. So we try and teach these skills then before going into then doing the work. And you teach someone the skills away from stress. And it's like, okay, this is easy, breathing mechanics. But some people even will still find it hard at the start. They just can't feel the diaphragm. They don't know what it feels like. They don't know the rib cage is out of position, so it's affecting the movement of it, whatever. So teach them it away from the stress. And it's okay, so I can feel the mechanics. Right, so now we're going to do the thing. We're going to do the breath, or we're going to do the stress. And there's different parts that I want you to work on when you're working on doing the breath hold. I want you to work on mentally challenging yourself through that. But then preempt the end of the breath hold. You know you're going to want to gasp, and we've understood that isn't the most effective way for you to recover your breathing. Utilize what we've practiced away. And then you've got two options. In my recovery period, do I want to get rid of all that CO2 that I built up so I recover quickly? Or do I want to try and say use the smaller holes in my face, the nose, to make it harder to get rid of the CO2? So my recovery period, I'm actually challenging myself a little bit during the recovery period. And that long term is going to make me better. But in the short term, it's going to potentially feel a little harder, if that makes sense. So even the recovery period can be make it as easy as possible, or actually make it part of the training.
I guess this is why we see it lots now I know you work with combat athletes, but we see it lots in sort of combat situations, and also on the rugby field. You see the team sort of come together under the posts, and there's sort of this kind of syncing of nasal breathing. Just to close the loop then on the CO2 tolerance, the breath hold stuff. Because it is difficult, and people will get really enthusiastic and go and try this stuff. How often would you be outside of warm up when we're actually training it? Then on the assault bike or whatever it may be. How often would you be putting that in someone's program?
If you think that look, we've got those two options in terms of going like you can do it during a hard session, but equally you could do it on an easy session where you're doing like just ticking over, and I could have the breath holds in that, where it's just not going to stress the body the same as the hard session. If you're going to do, like, the answer from an S&C perspective is, well, how many times would you do like red line anaerobic work on the assault bike?
Not very often.
Yeah, maybe once a week. So it's that type of scenario. But you can do them a few in your warm-ups and easy, it can be something that you do potentially every day or every training session, but just that particular scenario of like, balls to the wall, like redlining, like you wouldn't do that every day on something else. So you're not going to do it the same with breath holding. And this is one of the things I'm trying to get us to understand as coaches, of going, there's this thing that we've not looked at before. We're looking at it. Here's all the science for it. This is how it looks. Don't look at it as some other weird thing. Just approach it through the same mindset you would do for any other modality of your training, as long as we understand what it is. It's the same for like the diaphragm, in terms of, should we be strengthening our diaphragm? Well, if you think you should strengthen all muscles, why are we not doing that one? And we're not. And it's actually the one that's working even when you're not working. Even when you're asleep, it's still working. So it's like constantly working. What happens when you make a muscle stronger and improve its endurance? Functions better. And that's going to have massive implications on whether you're an endurance athlete or whether you're like a high intensity athlete. The MMA guys are fascinating.
Go on.
In that one thing that's very, they get it because there's an intuitive thing that they know before they've ever worked with someone like me, where they go, if we're in a cage now and one of us is going to get knocked out, if you lose control of your breathing and you signal that to me through mouth breathing, like they haven't necessarily read the Oxford Vantage book, but they know when that guy opens his mouth, I'm going to knock him out.
You hear a lot of the commentators talk about it in UFC, don't you?
And they know themselves. It's like, if it's me, if I lose control of my breathing, I'm fucked. If we're allowed to say that.
Yeah, you're allowed to.
Like, that's what they're saying. And one guy, he said to me, he's like, Jacko, I'm not good at anything in anything at all. The only thing I'm good at is fighting. And he was like, I'm not scared of anything. I'm not scared of anything in the world at all, other than being in that cage and losing control of my breathing. So if you can help me control my breathing, I'm in. And he was like the easiest guy I've ever worked with, because he just got it. Because for them, their sport is, I always could think of it as a tennis. Say you lose the final at Wimbledon in tennis, right? You're a bit sad, a few tears, and then you realise you still won £3.2 million or whatever. Like, it's not, it doesn't hurt. You lose in the cage where it's elbows and knees. It's so savage that it's just brutal. You are not a bit lackadaisical about something like breathing. And I think there's a lot that a number of other sports could learn from that sport in terms of that. You know, it's high intensity stuff for them, but it matters because it's like you're getting filled in, and not filled in like a bit filled in, like it's brutal. And so, like, you don't want to be the one that gets filled in. You don't want to be the one that loses your breath.
Yeah. Let's go to the other side, the other side of the coin that's still on the same side, because it's all kind of interlinked. There's a lot of coaches giving prescription for nasal only training. There's a lot of people that will know a little bit about nasal only. Discuss the importance for predominantly breathing through the nose in life and also in training.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one where like if we separate in life and in training, because in training it's contextual as to the training, and also it's contextual to the person. But generally speaking, in life, the nose, as you've got a few holes in your face, right? You've got your brain popping out of those ones, your eyes, and then you've got your big mouth, and then you've got the small holes in your nose. Your nose, if you look at the function anatomy of the nose, comparing it to the mouth, the nose is designed for breathing. There's 33 different functions of the nose that they've identified now that the mouth doesn't have in relation to breathing. In terms of, like, it's the start, like there's a gas in the nose, nitric oxide, start of your immune system. It's antiviral, antifungal, antibacterial. It protects your airways. There's just everything about the nose, and people can if they don't believe me, you can sort of go and look it up. It's there. Whereas the mouth is there mainly for things like eating and talking. We get into bad habits, and that larger vessel, the larger hole, is going to mean what we went back to earlier, saying breathing too much is actually being quite inefficient. Breathing also comes at an energy cost, which I think is fascinating that we overlook as well. The act of breathing requires energy. Do you breathe more when you're exercising? Yes. Do you want to spend energy on breathing during exercise, or do you want to spend energy on doing the exercise that you're doing? Well, if I improve my efficiency of my breathing and the strength of my breathing muscles, I'm going to spend less energy on breathing. I'm actually going to breathe less. I'll actually take less breaths in a session than someone that isn't trained. And I think the really fascinating thing is, and I'll come back directly to the questions. Really fascinating thing that it isn't as simple as, like, just because breathing is part of the cardiovascular system, it isn't as simple as breathing and being fit go together, in that someone that's fit is good at breathing and someone that isn't fit is bad at breathing. You can get fit without training your breathing at all. And if you don't have any awareness of your breathing, what's your breathing going to do? Just be on its auto setting. And you can train your muscles and everything to get fit, but if you've never done the breathing bit, you're missing a piece. So there was a player recently, plays internationally, fittest in his team in terms of fitness tests, but we had a conversation where he said, like, yes, I'm the fittest when it comes to a test, but when I finish that and I look around at everyone, he's like, I am blowing miles more than everybody else, miles more. There must be something I can do with my breathing. And I'm like, for sure, like, because you've never done anything yet. And just because you're the fittest doesn't mean you can't then still benefit. So you put the breathing piece on top of that for him. It's going to help him potentially even get even fitter, but certainly in terms of being able to recover and regulate, it's such an easy win. But so coming directly back to the question, the day-to-day nasal breathing, everything from like humidifying the air, keeping moisture in. Like, moisture is really important within the lungs to help with that diffusion of oxygen through the alveoli. into the blood. It protects the airways. It slows down our breathing naturally because it's just a smaller vessel. Depending on the shape of someone's face and the size of their nose, that's going to affect structurally how easy it is to breathe in and out through the nose. But most people, when they're not doing anything, sat down as you are now, you're sat down, your mouth is closed. You might not have been thinking about it, but your mouth is closed. And you can sit, on the tube, have a look around. Everyone that's sat down, even though they might be really bad at breathing, when you actually make them do some exercise, and that exercise could be just walking, at rest, it's very natural for people to close their mouth. You won't see, someone has to be really bad at breathing for them to be sat there just, but it does happen. You see these sort of casual mouth breathers where the mouth's just casually hung open. And one of the problems is obviously the breathing bit, but the other bit is when the mouth is casually open, the tongue is down. And then the tongue muscles are part of the muscles that support and actually help create your airway. So when your tongue gets lazy and gets weak, the muscles that support your airway and your neck get weak, and then you'll then breathe poorly for even when like sleep and stuff. So it's, yeah.
Okay.
But
So
during exercise, it's contextual to the exercise and what we're doing. It's not like, what's the purpose of the session? Where are you at in this journey of like, how fit are you? How much adaptation have you had to trying to breathe through your nose during exercise? If you're doing low level aerobic stuff, like you say, the zone 2 things, you will see your heart rate will be lower and you will recover faster after that session if you can do it nasally well. But this is where I get a little bit frustrated. But I was there myself where it was like, right, I'm just doing everything nasal. And I'm like making it super stressful because I'm working at intensity that I can't manage nasal. And then what happens when it's stressful? Nervous system, no good, but also mechanics. So the mechanics go out the window. So this notion that nasal breathing is better is too oversimplified, because if someone's mechanically breathing terribly and they're in a poor posture that's affected because your position of your ribcage will affect the ability for the diaphragm to work, all those things, if you're doing everything wrong, but the air is coming in and out of your nose, great that it's coming in and out of your nose, but if everything else is wrong, it's probably not the right strategy for you at that time. And so what I try to work with, because of the type of athletes and sports I work mainly with, is high intensity stuff like MMA fighters, like rugby, where they can't do it all nasally, but we work out what bits can you do nasally and how much, if you're more of a recreational athlete where you can choose intensity workout, how much effort do you want to go into and how prepared are you to take a couple of steps back in intensity sometimes to allow yourself to do those things nasally.
yeah, perfect. I mean, this is why I think the prescription of nasal breathing in a well-considered program is to moderate intensity for the athlete. And often people, like you said, I mean, I hate to think of what people look like in gyms doing nasal breathing, trying to work in intensity that they can't maintain the right mechanics.
Yeah, it's nasty.
Yeah, okay, cool. So we've touched on some really nice bits there about why nasal breathing is important. And you mentioned probably 20 minutes ago that the sort of vagus nerve, and we've mentioned the term parasympathetic.
Yeah.
How are those three things linked together?
So the vagus nerve sends about 80% of its information back up to the brain, so it's communicating from the body back up rather than everything else we typically think is like brain's in charge and it's just dictating everything back down. Your HRV is sort of a bit of biofeedback of a reflection of like vagal tone or the health of the vagus nerve. And as we saw in that, I mentioned about how breath holding in a warm up to create some upregulation actually dampens down the vagus nerve to create that upregulation. Well, if we're spending too much time stressed, the body doesn't like just keep, or the brain doesn't want to just, the nerve, the vagus nerve is just constantly saying, we're stressed, we're stressed, we're stressed. So eventually it's like, shut up, I know we're stressed, right? You just be quiet and I'll just stay in this state. There's a lot of things will affect the vagus nerve, like cold water, grounding, but breathing on a few modalities or a few aspects. So CO2, having that good tolerance, CO2 helps with vagal tone. So when we are less sensitive to it, we can tolerate it, better for your nervous system, better for your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve itself runs through the diaphragm. So when you are diaphragmatically breathing, you're literally sort of massaging the vagus nerve itself. Some of the down regulation practices will be utilizing like humming, because as the vagus nerve passes through the voice box, the vibrations that the humming creates innervates the vagus nerve. So then when we're combining that with diaphragmatically, we're like hitting it top and tail. Something I've seen from measuring people's HRV during like measuring it in real time, like your Whoop or whatever will typically do it for the last 24 hours. Measuring it in real time, one of the things, not always, because everyone's a little bit different, but one of the things that impacts HRV the most in real time to like let's say spike recovery post a session is getting the rib cage and pelvis aligned correctly stacked, so that we have the diaphragm moving through the like the correct zone of appositions, the distance the diaphragm like has to move through. That gets altered when we change the position of the rib cage. When the rib cage is out of optimal positioning, the movement of the diaphragm is suboptimal, so the amount it can move. And I'll see that when you measure someone's HRV and you get them breathing very, very slowly, very, very quietly, but getting the diaphragm moving through the greatest range that it can, we see HRV like absolutely loves it. And the final bit on it is like really slowing down exhalation. So every breath we take, which is hard to say without sounding like singing the song, every breath we take, on the inhale, your heart rate speeds up, and on the exhale, your heart rate slows down. The inhale, increasing heart rate is sympathetic activating of the nervous system. The exhale, slowing down the heart rate, parasympathetic promoting. So we bias and longer exhale because it literally helps to slow down the heart rate and promotes parasympathetic activation. When you combine that with the humming for the vagus nerve, like a hum naturally extends an exhale without putting effort in, because we're trying to create a very calm, relaxing, safe environment. For the body needs to feel safe in order to get out of that fight or flight. When you've been stressing it in the gym, like I'm not saying like you don't, no one goes, we're going to go to the gym later, I don't feel unsafe in there, but just in terms of like what the nervous system is responding to, you're stressing it. We need to let it feel safe in order to make that shift. And that's really important in terms of getting people to get into a better state of recovery, getting them into, if they're going to refuel after that session as well, getting some getting some saliva going in the mouth. That'll be something you'll notice if you do a down reg, but equally helping them like sleep better, like sleep being one of the most important things in terms of recovery. The state of your nervous system whilst you sleep is going to affect the quality of your sleep. The other thing that affects people's sleep a lot of the time is like what the mind is doing. And so if you don't have any time during the day where you actually like have some time to be still and quiet in the mind, chances are you lie down in bed, it's the first time you've been still. Like, of course you're going to have all sorts of things running through your head. Your brain hasn't had the chance to process what's been going on yet today. So it sort of ticks a number of boxes when you do a little bit of a down reg after a training session or later on in the day to set you up for better sleep.
So I've got here to unpack breath work for performance. I think we've done that.
I hope so.
Yeah. I've also got unpacking breath work for recovery, and I think I think we're almost at the end of that piece with everything we just said. So nasal breathing, slowing the exhale or prolonging the exhale as opposed to the inhale, stimulating the vagus nerve, driving parasympathetic tone, which is your rest, digest kind of phase. Great for when we're about to eat, great for when we're going to bed, great for when we just want stillness. Not so good for when we're going to go and play a sport or something, but it's the stuff that goes on when the sun goes down and we're trying to chill out. So so we also talked on the other side of that with the CO2 tolerance of some actual practical things that people can go and do in terms of breath holds. So on this side of the coin, as well as I guess thinking about nasal breathing only, prolonging the exhale, you mentioned the down reg. Is there a quick step-by-step guide we can do for a down reg?
Yeah,
let's do it.
Like as simple as close the mouth, put the tongue to the roof of the mouth, breathe quietly through your nose. Try to breathe as softly and quietly through your nose as possible, and start extending those exhalations, and then start humming. So depending on whether there's someone else in the room with you or whether you're going to find that weird, but humming is a great way to naturally extend the exhale. You
mentioned about, sorry to cut you off, stacking the rib cage and pelvis. Is lying down best for people here? Yeah,
so interesting that the diaphragm plays more than one role within the body. breathing's the obvious one, but it's also stabilizing midline. So when you lie on the floor, you take away its job to have to stabilize your midline, and it can just focus on breathing. So if we're lying on the floor, and then ribcage and pelvis sort of alignment is going to be better if we get the knees bent and the feet flat. So in that shape, we're going to be more likely to get a better positioning of the ribcage, and then yes, we can start to. People will find it much easier to breathe through with their diaphragm in that position, and also it's a nice, safe, relaxed position to be just supported by before you think or do anything else with it. And yeah, the main thing if you're going to try and to down rig is breathing very quietly, breathing very softly, and extending the exhales, but not trying to put effort into it. If I try and force a long exhale, you're then going to get triggered to like have a bit of a rushed inhale next. So the humming is great because if you just hum, it naturally makes your exhale longer without you having to put any effort into it. And then you keep there, then inhale nice and calm.
How long for?
10 minutes. Something's better than nothing. The chemoreceptors in the brainstem respond to like 1 minute apparently of breathing.
And because we've done it before, you've done it with me.
Yeah.
This kind of 360 breathing, trying to breathe sort of, out as a rib cage kind of coming, expanding, trying to keep the rib cage down and obviously breathe through the diaphragm. What are the key things, or where can people put their hands to try and help themselves encourage the breath going to the right place? Yeah,
so if you're on the floor, you also nice to get the feedback from the floor against the ribs at the back, because that's one area that, particularly if we're doing a lot of like power athletes where we've got a lot of posterior chain work going on, we get very tight through the back, through the erectors. We're more likely to get into more extended positions in terms of the rib cage. So we lack expansion at the back. If you get yourself on the floor, you try and get your pelvis and rib cage aligned together, knees being bent, feet flat will help with that. If I've got my hands on the outside of my ribs, I should be able to feel as I inhale, the rib cage expanding and pushing my hands out. I'll feel my belly going towards the ceiling as the diaphragm is pushing air and creating pressure on the inside. It's not that your lungs are in your belly, but that's where the movement's going to push from. And then you should also feel the ribs at the back, like pushing against the floor. If you're truly taking a three-dimensional breath, and the rib cage is three-dimensional, you're three-dimensional, your diaphragm is this big three-dimensional dome. There's more movement going to happen on sort of like your front side mechanics. So you're going to notice that more, but you should be able to feel stuff going into the back. And you see some really nice, when you start getting the rib cage aligned and the ribs moving a little bit more, you start to see some really nice knock-on effects through the rest of the kinetic chain in terms of like, thoracic rotation gets to be improved because actually, one, you've got things aligned, but two, you've got ribs at the back moving, those ribs connected into the spine. So there's often some freebies that I really like coaching because it makes people they feel better because they can just move a bit more. When your ribs can move, you can breathe. But equally, when if your thoracic's a bit tight, you play rugby. When someone frees that up, and because the issue is that your ribs aren't moving, it's like it takes just a few breaths, and then we do a little retest, and it's like, fucking hell, it feels better. It's like getting buy-in with people. If people listening to this podcast have never engaged in any of this stuff before, I want them to. There's certain things that they're going to do that make feel better straight. Like, oh wow, that was better. And there's other things that like you do a breath hold, and you're like, this feels horrible. Like so, if I'm working with someone, I'm always trying to like find what's the order of things I want to do with them that's going to resonate most with them, for them to have that sort of light bulb moment of like, yeah, breathing is working. Because there's always that like, is it really going to do anything? And so we want to try and get that bit started. And some of the other bits are long-term, adaptations that are going to take a little bit more time, but we've got to get some buy-in at the start. We're in the early phases where like, people used to think the world was flat and everyone laughed at them. But I read Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changed Itself, in the 80s or 90s, saying that neuroplasticity, like the brain can change itself, and all of the other doctors laughed at him. And now it's like, you talk about neuroplasticity, it's like, everyone's talking about neuroplasticity. It's like, yeah. But the first people that were saying that this was possible were told that you can't change the brain, you can't train this, you can't neuroplasticity, that's ridiculous. Ridiculed him. And it's just, you get it still now. It's getting better, but it's like, you can't train breathing. I'm like, what do you mean you can't train breathing? Of course you can train breathing. Like, you can do it right. Like, to me, but I'm down that rabbit hole. So it's like,
I mean, I can vouch for it because, like I said, we spent the best part of 2 years, and not only did my breathing become much better and all those metrics that we spoke about, the breath holds, etc., but the pain I was in, particularly around hips and lower back, like it all seemed to work its way out. That daily pain from injuries and things, because of the better alignment of rib cage, pelvis, and things just working more efficiently. It was profound. The reason I don't know what the reason is to why I stopped. I think it actually comes down to time. As bad as that excuse is.
No.
During that period where, like, lockdown, where we had time to start to optimize everything, and everyone I took to trying to focus on performance and things I wasn't doing, like breath work. I had a bit more time to do it, and then of course life takes over. And this isn't it's a poor excuse, but you go back into the rat race, and
that's the reality for everyone though. Whether someone's a professional athlete or whether someone isn't, it's always the same. So my role as the coach goes into more relevant of what it is. It's more goes into like, how am I going to help you make this just more normal? Like, what bits can we do that are part of because there'll be certain things that you do now that I would be able to go, well, that exercise I showed you, you're going to do it with that thing. And that one you're going to do with that thing. And that we actually, we can do that later, but we haven't had that actual conversation, but that's where it's got to go.
Talk to me about the role then it's played with you in these ultras and running up mountains.
It's being able to regulate your nervous system when you're going far beyond what, I did silly things like signed up to some stuff initially that was beyond my physical capabilities, nearly beyond my mental capabilities, but I did manage to just do it. And I didn't do enough. I didn't train enough. But I didn't know what I was doing, so it was new to me. So I thought I was training enough. I was like, I feel like I'm running a lot more than I used to, but it's like it's not enough for the thing that you're going to go and try and do. And recovery during these things is enormous. So we're talking about efficiency of breathing. So the whole like when you're doing an ultra, you're running very far. You're not running very fast. So it shouldn't be difficult to maintain it nasally, but maintaining it nasally will keep your heart rate lower. And you can see, I've tracked this myself, and people can do it themselves. Go and run at a 6-minute K pace, something that's relatively comfortable, whatever's comfortable for you, and then run it doing it nasally and see. So long as you are able to breathe nasally and use your diaphragm effectively, slow down your breathing rate, like be conscious about your breathing rate. And rather than let your breathing rate just go too fast, just because you're exercising, but just because you're jogging, choose to keep your breathing rate slower. You will see your heart rate be slower. And if you go and run for 12 hours with the heart rate 10 beats less, the body has not worked as hard to do that work, or some elements of it, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I think where people in current society or the fitness culture is that people glorify elevated heart rate and working harder, not realizing that actually what you're saying is if we do all of this stuff, the capacity, your ceiling to be able to then work harder for longer when the time is required is far superior.
It's like my baseline. If I'm take the international player I mentioned earlier, where he said he's really fit, but like he's completely blowing out of his ass compared to everyone else, even though he wins the test. Breathing rate, 22 breaths per minute, sat down like this, just having a chat about breathing. 22 breaths per minute. When I run my ultra, I'm breathing at less than that. When I'm running like a 50-minute 10K, I'm breathing less than that because my baseline is about 10. Whereas you're already breathing twice as hard in terms of rate when you're doing nothing. What happens with exercise? It goes up. So you're going to reach that ceiling. Everyone's got a ceiling in terms of breathing rate where it just becomes like panting and fast. And when it goes panting and fast, everything's going out the window. Your mechanics is going out the window. Your CO2 is all over the place. Your head's all over the place. Your nervous system's like, let's shut this thing down. It makes you stop. So if you are more efficiently breathing at rest, you've got like a lower starting point for like your breathing rate, which is going to also help you maintain a lower breathing rate when you're exercising. It's going to keep your heart rate down. I'm the opposite in terms of my running. On my Strava, I'll celebrate like, oh, my VO2 max has gone up, great, but I've just done this run and look how low my heart rate is. Like it's stayed under 130 30 or whatever it is.
Well, I think anyone that knows what they're talking about is focusing on those bits. So I think that's why Zone 2 became such a thing in the industry, or is and has been for the last year, with personal trainers and coaches trying to promote the importance of Zone 2 training, and trying to create education around it to try and make it a little bit sexier.
Yeah.
To train your heart rate at a lower intensity for longer periods of time, because the bigger the base, the taller the pyramid.
Yeah.
But I think people feel as though, because at the other end of that, what's commercially kind of working, or what the boutique gyms and big box gyms are trying to promote, is work out in 20 minutes as hard as you can, as many times as you can each week, and get that heart rate as high as humanly possible, which is adding more stress to the situation.
It's always contextual, isn't it? It's like, is that right? Well, it depends. Depends on the person. It depends on their goals, what they're trying to achieve. It depends on their current state of physical and mental well-being. That's the truth of it. So
to wrap this up, then, I think we know why the common constraints for people to put this into action are time and just maybe understanding or placing importance on it. I think we brought to light all the reasons why you'd want to do this. Everything from an everyday fitness consumer or person right through to competitive athletes, but still at the very top of it. And you will know very well from your time in sport, but also your time now working with top elite sports teams, national teams and professional teams. Why is there still a disconnect between this, a topic that is, we know we can train it, we know we can get benefits, we know how important those benefits are for performance. Why are people not doing it as much? Why is it still so niche?
It's still like if you go and just search PubMed or Google Scholar, like the amount of research there is in all these different modalities or aspects of breathing we talked about, it's all there. And some of it's like 20 years old, more than 20 years old. So it's been there a while, but it just takes more time for these things to come through. I think it is one of the most interesting parts of training for me, in that it has the automatic as well as the conscious. You know, if you're going to go and build strength, you've got to go and do strength work. It doesn't happen automatically. Whereas with breathing, because it has this automatic state for it, a misconception is that then we can't change it. But anyone right now I could just say, right, take a bigger inhale or slow down your exhale. You're immediately changing it. Like, you can choose to immediately change it. And if you can change something consciously, you can create some sort of adaptation. And if you can create an adaptation, well, then we're training. It's just going to take, and it started, but it's just going to take more and more of the top athletes and teams to then be doing this, and then it trickles down and comes through. At the moment, it's mainly being done for those that are doing it relatively quietly, because it's like, you don't want to go and tell everyone necessarily about it
because of the competitive advantage.
Because you're trying to get an edge. But yeah, do
you think there's many people still that I was going to say poo-poo it? Is there any people that dismisses the role of importance, the importance of it?
You can, yes, that can't. Yeah, that's still there for some people, but there's a multitude of reasons why that can happen. In that, like, you know, I'm, as an S&C coach, same yourself, like, I feel a bit silly. Why didn't I think about breathing when I was coaching? And also when I was doing a lot of work with like swimmers, where breathing's like part and parcel. I didn't do anything about breathing. I feel like a bit of an idiot. And so that I know that about myself. I've come to it and you know, really gone down a rabbit hole with it, because for me, lots of good strength coaches out there, people that are doing all the other bits of strength and conditioning far better than I would. And I just see this is a foundation that everything else can be built upon. Not trying to say that it's the most important thing, but it's the thing that's happening whether you think about it or not. And I think that regardless of what you do, you're always breathing. And when you're exercising, your breathing rate or your breathing volume will always increase. That is just an absolute given, and everyone knows that, and no one's going to argue with that. So if it's always going to go up and be challenged, well, why wouldn't I train it? is what, like how I look at it now. And I think I guess a final thing from me would be that even just your awareness, hopefully having listened to the podcast, just your awareness of your breathing. We know that if someone counts their breathing and thinks about their breathing, they automatically slow it down. Even if I don't say slow it down, I say think about your breathing or count it, you will slow it down. So next time you're in the gym on the bike, and maybe you just do something really simple, just do really simple things, like you're just ticking over in the warm-up or you're doing a bit of a cool down. Just think about your breathing and notice that you can slow it down. And when you control it a bit more and you slow it down a little bit, you feel a little bit better. And just start the ball rolling there. But whatever you're doing, you're breathing. And if you just think about it, it's going to help a little bit. But there's the other side of it is if it's a sporting context, I don't want a rugby player thinking about his breathing when he's on the field because he's thinking about rugby. So we've got to do some work to change the auto. But that's the beauty of it. You change the auto over time. It's not then your actual auto is you've got a new default. So it's not something that you have to continually. You can if you want to keep trying to like push the envelope, but you are going to make long-term progress if you go through that and stick to the process.
Nice. I think we've shed the light on everything we need to. I think from a practical setting for people, this is maybe given some understanding why you're seeing people wear nose strips, why you're seeing people wear mouth tape when they go to bed, why you're seeing sports teams or fighters when they go back to the corner trying to regulate their breathing quickly. Yeah. The only thing I think we didn't touch on, which maybe just a quick 60 seconds, with the training masks, altitude masks, those types of things. Yeah, are they worthwhile for people? What exactly is going on there?
So it's the training masks are training masks. They're not an altitude.
They're not going to simulate altitude.
So it won't simulate altitude in terms of levels of oxygen, of hypoxia. But as we discussed before, if you hold your breath, then you can get that bit. The other part, interestingly, of altitude is that it's not just that the air being thinner, that there's relatively less oxygen, and you're gonna experience lower levels of oxygen in your blood as you go to altitude. The other element to it is the way that we breathe is we increase. It's a pressure differential is how we breathe. We increase the volume inside of us to decrease pressure compared to outside, and that's air's moving from high to low. Well, if we go to altitude and the air is thinner, air pressure being slightly less outside of us compared to inside of us, our body's got to work a bit harder to make that pressure differential happen. So it's got to work hard in terms of the expansion. Well, what's that? That's breathing. What muscle is doing that? Diaphragm, intercostal. So there's an element to the training mask that trains resistance. So you inhale and exhale, which is actually relevant to altitude training. But the fact that people marketed them 10, 20 years ago as altitude masks and they don't actually change your blood level, your oxygen levels in the blood, they got poo-pooed, which is unfortunate because they're a really great tool. The other thing is the CO2 that you breathe out stays in that mask and you rebreathe it in. And that's when things really get tasty.
Tough. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I implore people just to go and start to put some of these bits into action. I think it's on the one hand, like we said, measure baseline for your breath hold and go and try and do some.
And I've got a free course that's got like that assessment.
Oh, amazing.
We've got a free course, it's got that assessment. It's got basics of biochemistry, basic biomechanics, how to manage breathing during exercise as a starting point, breathing for down regulation recovery, breathing for sleep. It's like 7 modules long.
Sick. Well, and I was going to say to people, because I mean, your social media is fantastic for this thing, and it's great to see the following. You know, it's grown. You know, it's fantastic. I think the way you deliver the information is really cool as well. Thanks. So, where do people find all that?
So the website is probreathwork.com, available as an app as well, and my Insta's jacko.david.jackson.
Perfect. I think we wrap it there, mate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacko. Appreciate it. Pleasure. We're actually going to go off now to I'm going to try and make it. But we're going to go to the gym now, and you're going to take our coaching team through some bits and pieces that they can integrate into their own work, but also with the members of our gym. If there are any personal trainers, gym owners, athletes listening to this, Jacko does lots of coaching with everyone from trainers and gyms right through to elite athletes. So reach out. Thank you, mate.
Cheers.